Great, why don't we get started? Again, my name is Stephan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program at GPS. And I'm joined today also by one of my great faculty colleagues, Rafael Fernández, who directs the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies. And this seminar today is co-sponsored by the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies and the Korea Foundation. Curtis? So for those of you who are not familiar with GPS and for our distinguished guests today, the school offers a series of degree programs, including a Master's of International Affairs with a Korea specialization. So if any of you are logging on from outside of the GPS community, please feel free to go to our website and you can get information on the school. We've posted that there. This webinar series meets every Monday afternoon at 4. We have a special guest today who's joining us from Korea, so he's up early. But here are some things that are coming down the pike. We're going to have a panel on COVID next week with some new research by Jungmin Lee and Munsub Lee here at GPS. We'll talk about space issues in Northeast Asia with Sam Wilson from the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. We'll talk about new research on inequality and a panel on the North Korean economy. But today, I'm really pleased to introduce the Mexican ambassador to the Republic of Korea, Bruno Figueroa. And as we'll talk about, he concurrently holds the position of the Mexican ambassador to the DPRK as well as Mongolia. So I think we'll have a very interesting discussion of Mexico's relations with East Asia more generally. But let me just tell you a few things about Ambassador Figueroa. He has a degree in international affairs from the Colegio de Mexico, obviously one of its most distinguished institutions. And also I found very interesting, Mr. Ambassador, that you have an MBA from France. And perhaps that you can tell us at some point about that side of your career. Since 1987, he's had a very distinguished career with the Mexican Foreign Service. He served, for example, at the OECD. He served as a consul general in San Jose here in California. He directed an extremely interesting project called the Mesoamerica Project, which deals with Mexico's relationship with Central America. And also, I think for many who don't follow Mexico and its rising place in the world, he's held positions within the Mexican Aid Agency. And so that's a very interesting set of experiences that the ambassador has as well. In 2019, those of you who are Koreans would be familiar with Jung-ang Ilbo. He was cited as, for his public diplomacy efforts by Jung-ang Ilbo as the public diplomat of the year or something to that effect. Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for joining us for this discussion. Let me just say one thing about our procedure and then we'll start the conversation. If you have questions and you put them in the chat function, we'll try to monitor that. So I'll try to keep an eye on or maybe you have a Q&A, we'll try to keep an eye on that. So if you have questions, we can turn to them. But Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for joining us. Let me start with a kind of general question that I think will be interesting to our listeners. GPS was founded on the basis of trying to teach our students about East Asia and the Americas, but we don't pay much attention to the growing relationship between Asia and the Americas. I mean, this has really been a quite significant development over the last 15 or 20 years. So I'm going to lead with a somewhat general question, but can you say some things about how Mexico thinks about its relations with the Asia Pacific more generally? It's obviously been very close to the United States and other countries in Latin America, but Asia seems to be assuming a new role.
Thank you very much, Professor Haggard, Professor Fernández de Castro. It's really a great pleasure for me to join you in this webinar. I'm really thrilled, Professor Haggard. I always read your articles about your analysis on this part of the world, which has always surprises and things to think about. So I I start answering to your question, I think this is one of the key issues regarding Mexico's relationship to the so-called Far East. For us, it's our Near West. Definitely, the Pacific is today Mexico's future, present and future. And it represents its most dynamic relationship. Just only if you took trade, if you take trade as one factor of our relationship with the world, 5 out of the first 6 trade partners of Mexico are Pacific region countries. I'm talking about, of course, in North America, the US and Canada, but also China, Japan, and Korea.
Interesting.
As I mentioned, it's a very dynamic relationship because year by year, we see how much this relationship is evolving and strengthening. I've been in Korea for 3.5 years, and Korea was Mexico's 6th trade partner, and today it's 5th trade partner in the world. Mm-hmm. It even surpassed Japan as our trade partner. Why is it so? If you ask me in a nutshell, what I would say is that the Mexico and Korea are perfect example of 21st century relationships fueled by globalization itself. Korea is using Mexico as a platform for its businesses with North America. Mexico is an integral part of global value chains. Korea is now a fully globalized country. Koreans, consumers in Korea buy German cars, love carnitas tacos, and have Mexican avocado with their bibimbap. No, that's a fact. That's a fact. Communications today are fast and free, and K-pop is a trending topic in Mexico with hundreds of thousands of followers. And Cancun today is less than 20 hours away for Korean honeymooners, since we opened a direct Aeromexico flight between Seoul and Mexico City. What is amazing is that this relationship was almost non-existent 25 years ago. We are separated by the largest ocean in the world. We're talking about 20,500 kilometers between Mexico and Korea. And 25 years ago, we almost knew nothing about a society so different from ours. Rafael at the time worked at the foreign ministry, and so he might remember that it only started to get the attention of Mexico's officials to see Asia as the great opportunity and the future for us. And that was an accurate view, because really this evolution, 25 years is nothing in history. And it's really amazing to see this incredible change in those 25 years.
Yeah, let me ask you a question, and you know, if this is, feel free to deflect if this is sensitive, but I'm wondering about the relationship between economics and diplomacy. So, you know, there are obviously common economic interests. For example, you mentioned that Korea has an interest in Mexico because of the NAFTA 2.0 and before that. But does Mexico see its relationship with Asia as providing some sort of strategic benefit for Mexico as well, diversifying its relationships, its trade and diplomatic relationships?
It's, of course, and a very important part of our diversification strategy. We could discuss if we have succeeded or not, if you see the numbers of our trade and investments coming from North America, but precisely because of the huge weight of our trade with North America and investments, the more we need to bring partners from other parts of the world. And of course, Europe was always a balance to North America in the last century. But definitely today it's Asia, and not only the traditional large countries such as Japan or China. Now we have Korea, and we have Southeast Asia also entering as very important a partner to us. But yes, it's more than economics, trade, and investments. Of course, this is one of the most important components. But in international politics, we also find allies, very, very strong allies in that part of the world, and especially Korea. We can come later about this, but Mexico and Korea are middle powers, and we share a lot of same views regarding what's happening in the world about global governance. And in New York, in Geneva, we sit together and we talk a lot, we consult a lot, and we vote the same way in many international issues.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and it was a direction I was going to take up later. But since you've opened it, let's talk about this. We're seeing this growth of cooperation among middle powers, trying to strengthen the multilateral features of the international system. And one thing that I was surprised to learn about, frankly, just with this talk, was the MICTA, this plurilateral agreement or club, I guess you might call it, between Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, and I think it's Turkey and Australia are the other members, correct? Mm-hmm. Can you speak to this? I mean, this is something I'll bet you most of our listeners are completely unaware of this initiative. It's something quite distinctive.
Yeah, I think this is distinctive of the world today. The world was easier and maybe scarier 50 years ago under the Cold War, because you could only be in three groups: the American group, the Soviet group, and the so-called non-aligned. Not much space for anything else in those times. But today, the world is getting more complex politically, with countries getting more strength in many ways, and more countries as such, more independent states than 50 years ago. So MICTA is a reflection of how the world is reconfiguring itself, how it's fragmenting politically. And what we have in common, those five countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia, we are middle powers, ambitious middle powers, that we have some influence in our regions. Most of us live under the shadow of superpowers. That's also important to say. We have suffered in the past. We feel the heat being so close to superpowers. And sometimes I like to characterize MICTA as an anti-bullies group. We found it's an informal setting of countries. That's very important to say. It's an informal set. We meet at foreign ministers level. We have never met at the level of heads of state, but we meet at least twice a year at the ministers of foreign affairs level, but also a lot in other levels. And not only the executive powers, the heads of parliaments also gather once a year. We have MICTA groups, think tank MICTA meetings, we have youth meetings. So the idea behind that is how can we be stronger, knowing us better together, talking together and taking common positions. If you sum up the economic power of MICTA, it's quite impressive.
Yeah, yeah.
So we take views on the most important issues in the world today. We have emitted dozens of communiques with our positions. This year, for instance, the pandemic is one of the key crucial issues, and several of us are very much interested in getting, for instance, a vaccine that is universal, accessible to all. And so in MICTA, we shared that view, and so we presented that view to all the world. That's MICTA in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, I noticed that the other thing that's interesting about the MICTA grouping is that I think all of the member countries are also members of the G20, correct? And
yeah.
Yes, this is, if you step, I believe that's the cohesion. I mean, that's the link. And Bruno, I wanted to ask you before we move to some other things. I remember since 12 years ago, South Korea has been looking for to negotiate a free trade agreement with Mexico. And what is very interesting to note is that despite we don't have an FTA, a bilateral FTA, now South Korea surpassed Japan as the 5th Mexican trade partner. What's happening there? I mean, because I believe that an FTA might be able to just inject a lot of energy to the bilateral relationship. Is there any problem out there? And Bruno, something else that I believe is just very, very interesting is that there's more than 2,000 Korean firms in Mexico. So that's, I mean, that's amazing. A huge amount of economic opportunity. If you could just comment on that, Bruno.
Yes, thank you, Rafael. Definitely, that's a very interesting thing to analyze, because Korea is a newcomer in Mexico compared to other big economic powers that have been investing in Mexico in the last 50 years, such as Japan. Korea has been the last country to enter the automobile sector in Mexico. Hyundai Kia built a factory in Monterrey. It was inaugurated only in 2016, and it's producing around 100,000 cars per year. And it has been a hit, a real smash, not only because of its impact in Korean investments in Mexico. It jumped $3 billion, just taking into account not only the Kia factory, but all the first, second, third layer companies investing in Monterrey, but also in surrounding states, building auto parts. So we're talking about a direct impact in the last 3 years of more than $3 billion US. It's really, as I mentioned, so dynamic by the day. But it has also an impact in trade, since the more you invest, the more you are bringing goods from your own country, but also you are taking goods from the country you're investing in to your own. So if you see the composition of Mexico's trade with Korea, you would see that you find, let's say, traditional products that are so important to Mexico, such as oil, mineral oils, metals and mineral ores. In total, we're talking about 60% of our exports to Korea are composed by those primary products. But the following components are very interesting of what we export to Korea, because you would not think about it. Electrical equipment and parts, machinery and mechanicals, instruments and optical devices. We're talking here about, let me count, more than 20% of our exports.
Striking, yeah.
So the thing is, we started talking about the negotiation of a free trade agreement 15 years ago in 2005.
I remember.
We announced the strategic relationship in a visit of Mexico's president to Korea, Vicente Fox, and a visit of Korean president to Mexico. But then we were negotiating with Japan, and that negotiation was not an easy one. So Mexico said, look, we will wait a little bit and do negotiate with you. Then it was very interesting to see that there was a lot of concern in both sides of the ocean. In Korea, agricultural producers were concerned about an invasion of Mexican product. Korea, we have to say, it's still quite a protective country regarding many products, and in particular agricultural products. When you know that, for instance, 100% of the tomatoes that are sold in Korea are produced in Korea. They are not, tomatoes coming from abroad are not allowed in Korea. And I can tell you dozens of examples of this protectionism. So the producers were quite concerned about this. And in Mexico, it was the industry, and especially the industry in Monterrey, but I'm talking about the steel, about chemicals, and also the automobile industry was quite concerned in Mexico about the negotiation and signature of a free trade agreement. So that also stalled negotiations for many years. Today, the scenario is quite different, since Korea now produces cars in Mexico. Their cars are Mexicans, and they they share the same issues as any other car producer in Mexico. Now, I would say that now we are ripe for such a negotiation, but of course we have to wait for the proper moment to do that. It's more a political decision today than the economics are set, I would say.
Yeah, this opens just an interesting line of questioning. If I recall, several years ago, the Mexican Senate ratified participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Korea's position on the TPP has been hesitant. They haven't gotten in yet. I think they prefer this bilateral trade strategy. I mean, I think they have more bilateral FTAs than any other country in Asia. And I know this is not directly on Korea, but can you talk a little bit about the TPP? Because that seemed like a quite bold move to join with these other Asian countries, even as the United States was leaving the TPP.
Yes, TPP fate, I think it shows what is happening in the world today with new ideas, new configurations, but also a lot of hesitations, countries moving 2 steps forward and 1 step back, especially thinking about the US, which was the country that put a lot of strength in TPP at the beginning. It was mostly a US initiative to get most of the economies of the Pacific in this new trade agreement that covered other areas such as services and industrial patents, and so on. And so Mexico immediately joined the negotiations, as many other countries, but Korea was hesitant at the beginning. As you mentioned, its bilateral strategy was working so well and so strong. That's on one hand, but on the other, we have also to consider the difficult issue of trade competition with Japan. With the TPP, Korea and Japan, countries that do not have free trade agreements, would have to compete in the same areas of products, such as cars, steels, and chemicals. So Korea was very hesitant at the beginning. And after a couple of years, it was too late to join TPP. Then what we saw is the US leaving TPP. And so we finished the negotiations without the country that initiated this. So this is really, again, expressing what is, for me, is happening in the world today, and how dynamic it is, and we will see many things regarding trade, investing, economics in the Pacific region.
You made an observation that I'd like to follow up, and maybe I misheard you, but you suggested that there might be a decline in protectionist forces in Mexico. I mean, obviously, there are always going to be certain sectors that are resistant to opening the economy. I mean, look at the United States. We have the same game. But you suggested that the growth of foreign direct investment into Mexico from Asia, as well as the United States and Europe, may be creating new kind of political dynamics in Mexico that make it more open than it's been in the past. Would you say that's correct? Or are there partisan differences which are still significant on trade policy in Mexico? How do you read this?
Definitely there is no rollback. Mexico entered the train of globalization and open trade and investments in the early 90s. And since the dimension of jobs that globalization has created in Mexico and wealth, it's impossible to think that there could be a rollback. Our president has been very clear, inviting foreign companies to invest, to keep investing in Mexico, and not only from North America. Precisely a couple of days ago, the Minister of the Economy, Mrs. Marquez, has been talking to several large companies, CEOs or representatives in Mexico, asking them to continue investing in Mexico and mentioning them the opportunities that the new USMCA, North American Trade Agreement, means to international companies. There were some concerns a few years ago when the US decided to renegotiate NAFTA. And I can tell you, I met several times with key players in Korea, especially in the automobile and steel sectors. Now they are okay with the new trade dispositions, and they will adapt to the new rules. But what we see is that I think it's getting even accelerating with what is happening in this part of the world, in Asia, and especially in China. We have been seeing China as a newcomer investing in Mexico, but also countries such as Korea redirecting investments to Southeast Asia and also to Mexico.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. And would you say that, of course, this was part of President Trump's objective, but I wonder if Mexico actually benefited by some of the changes in rules of origin, local content requirements, regional content requirements. Has that been associated with an increase? You suggested an increase in investment from outside, from Asia.
Yeah, USMCA is still a very young agreement, but you know, firms just add their costs. And so I think it will be quite complex. It will be much complex than before for companies in certain sectors, especially the automobile and steel sector, because definitely they will have to invest in the US, invest in Mexico, but I would say most importantly, invest in the region, because regional content has to be stronger now than before.
Right.
And definitely Mexico will benefit from those dispositions. But it's not only that. What we have been seeing in the last years is that it has been more difficult to invest in China for many reasons, local competition, but also for political reasons. You can see trends where there are more investments in countries such as Vietnam. I think Vietnam is Mexico's equivalent in Asia.
And competitor in a sense.
You have a lot of skilled workers. Payments are much lower, of course, than what you find in the Northern Asian countries. And it's been now a hub for building and industries for the great market that is Asia and Southeast Asia. So I think it's a very fluid what we are witnessing now in terms of firms. The issue, there are other external factors that put into question global value chains. Since I would say the earthquake of Kobe in Fukushima in 2011, where suddenly factories in the US could build no more cars, for instance, because of parts coming from Japan. The pandemic also showed the importance of relying more in closer to your markets than really depending on too stretched global value chains.
Bruno, if you don't mind, Steph, now that you
Sure, of course.
China, Bruno, I wonder, how you see that the trade war between China and the US and the tensions in the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Washington will affect Mexico-South Korean relations. And let me just, for example, you're right, Bruno, I believe that now supply chains is about security, it's about not being that far away. You know, in Tijuana, just during the COVID-19 emergency situation, there's been 71, 72 new firms coming into Tijuana just across the border to San Diego because, I would say, because of location. I mean, where else better than Tijuana? I mean, it's just next door to Silicon Valley. You were the Consul General in San Jose. And that's, that's the heart of Silicon Valley. So I wonder if you could give us a sense on how you feel about Mexico getting advantage of this new idea of having security in supply chains, because this is because COVID-19 have shown the fragility of having these investments so far away from your production side. And again, how will this impact the Mexico-Korea relationship?
Definitely, Rafael, companies abhor insecurity in the long term. So if companies see medium and long-term trends that do not favor them, they will look for solutions elsewhere. Again, nearshoring today is the key word compared to global value chains, and Mexico will benefit from that as Vietnam will. I don't think what is currently happening between the US and China will affect Mexico and Korea's relationship, because Korean companies produce a lot in Korea. They have a strong network of production in Asia, and more in Mexico. So I don't see any issue having an impact because of the China-US relationship there. In the long term, the question, I think for Korea, it's more important to think about what it will become itself if there is an escalation in this economic war between China and the US, because Korea is really in the middle. If you see the trade composition, the trade pattern of Korea, you will see that China plus Hong Kong make the most important partners, trade partners for Korea. We're talking about more than 30%, 1/3 of Korea's trade goes to China and Hong Kong. So the impact will be there. The most important exports from Korea, as you know, are chips, integrated circuits. That's almost 20% of all Korea's exports in value. And guess which country receives more integrated circuits than any other? It's China and Hong Kong. So that's where companies like Samsung are thinking very hard how to deal with the uncertainties brought by this trade war. That's where I see the most important challenge because of that war.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruno.
That's really interesting. So we're a little bit of a family here, Mr. Ambassador, so I have to pass on greetings from Guillermo Fernández, who says, "Hola, Bruno, qué gusto verte."
Muchas gracias, Guillermo.
So just a shout out.
From San Jose.
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
that's wonderful.
We have some questions about other forms of potential cooperation between Mexico and Korea, including on public health, which we might come back to depending on whether you choose to. But let me raise another question from Julio Flores. Asks about another sector, which of course is extremely important to Mexico, which is the oil sector, and the whole question of whether budgetary constraints in Mexico with respect to investments by Pemex could lead to South Korea or other Asian countries becoming partners with respect to oil, the oil sector. I mean, you've talked about the high tech end, electronics, automobiles, which are driven partly by the USMCA, but could there possibly be opportunities with respect to natural resource extraction? That's been a controversial issue, I know.
Well, that's a very interesting and quite an important question, precisely because Korea is a great engineering power today. It's amazing to see how many very large Korean companies are producing, investing infrastructure linked not only to oil, but to energy in general. They're very strong in the Middle East, but they are also quite strong in Mexico. As you know, the most important infrastructure project today in Mexico is the construction of a refinery in South Mexico, in Tabasco, in a place called Dos Bocas. And it's a Korean company, Samsung Engineering, which is building 1/3 of that refinery. You find Korean companies that participate in constructing infrastructure, but also that have been investing in the last decades in gas terminals in Manzanillo. Not only they built it, but they also manage this gas terminal, and also in clean energies. You would be surprised to know how many projects of solar and wind energy are built and are managed by Korean companies. So definitely I would say that Korea is today a very important partner for Mexico in its energy production and distribution.
So again, you obviously have a lot of fans, Mr. Ambassador. Marlon Marroquin also sends greetings to you, the Executive Regional Director of the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce. So we're glad you're on the webinar. This is a somewhat broad question. You know, academics, we're often asking things which are kind of vague, but to what extent do you see these processes that you've described as driven primarily by private sector initiatives? And to what extent is the Mexican government really seeing these as opportunities that will require some government participation to make them work? I mean, obviously you're an ambassador. When I interviewed the American ambassador to South Korea once 30 years ago, and one of the things he said is, I'm surprised by how much of my time is taking up with commercial issues, you know, that I was spending my time with. I thought I was going to be talking about politics and the nuclear question and all of that, and it was really about firms, you know, and doing business. I know this is somewhat a vague question, but how active is the government in trying to build these linkages?
Well, if you're talking so much about business, it's because Mexico and Korea, we trade more than $20 billion a year today. It's the double than 10 years ago. So suddenly in Mexico, and Rafael can vouch that, you saw troves of Koreans arriving in Mexico, linked to business more than anything else. The Korean community today is stronger than 15,000 people. So really that was inconceivable 25 years ago. That's 21st century, that's what's happening in the 21st century. But regarding your question, Professor, well, governments set the rules, and then the private sectors abide to those rules and can expand or not expand within those rules. And I think Mexico has been doing that for international business in the last 25 years, and it's still doing that today. Again, we need, and that was very clear since the beginning of its tenure, President López Obrador said, in order for the Mexican economy to grow, we need more investments, local and foreign. For good or for bad, Mexico still needs a lot of foreign investments to grow. That's our reality.
Bruno,
come back to, go ahead, Rafael, please. Yeah.
I mean, once talking to you, you let me know that you've been studying in South Korea in your time there about the participation of Mexican Americans in the Korean War. And that's a very interesting historical anecdote. I wonder if you could share with us, I mean, what was the participation of Mexican Americans in that war?
Sure, Rafael. This year, 2020, marks the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the war. nothing to rejoice, of course, but an anniversary, a very important anniversary. History brings very strange things. When I was named as ambassador to Korea, I remember that my father had a friend, a Mexican friend, who fought in Korea. At the time, I was a kid. I could not really understand what that meant. Where was Korea, what it was, and the Korean War. But when I came here, I decided to dig a little bit about this question. And what we found, we did a research, the embassy plus the Mexican government, we did a research and we found something really amazing. More than 100,000 soldiers of Mexican origin fought in Korea. This is, in the US Army, the second largest minority after African American, but the largest foreign component of the American Army, because Mexico did not send soldiers to Korea. Mexico kept neutral in that war. In fact, Mexico has not waged any war in any side since the Second World War. But so suddenly you discover that thousands of Mexican nationals were in Korea under the UN flag, under the United States colors. And that's because of something you know very well, Rafael, which is demographics and migration between Mexico and the US. We're talking about the first wave of Mexican migrant going north during and after the Mexican Revolution, when it was so easy to cross. You only had to pay 10 cents and cross legally the border to the US. And so you had there the first generation of Mexican getting to the US, and their sons born in the 20s were drafted or decided to join by themselves the US Army and came to Korea. Even the father of one of our colleagues, Ambassador Ivan Sierra, when he knew I was doing this research, he told me, you know, my father, still alive, he's 90 years old, he's a Korean War veteran.
Wow.
That's impressive.
That's really,
yeah, unbelievable.
But he's a Mexican citizen. He never took the US citizenship.
No, as many others, he went north. You know, the Bracero program was very important since the Second World War. And many Mexican workers, when their contract ended, they decided to stay in the US. And one way of staying legally and getting later American citizenship was entering the US Army.
That's amazing, Bruno.
I had no idea. No.
The Bracero programs, there were 5 of them. They started in 1942, and they, in total, and they lasted until 1965, and in total, 4.5 million Mexicans came to work in the US. Basically, during the war, it was basically to help feed Americans, because most of American workers, they were basically building arms, building tanks, building airplanes. So the Mexicans came to replace those Americans. Some of them stay over. And yes, it's, I mean, a big wave of migration came from Mexico to the US, but basically asked by the US to come and help during the war effort. So this is wonderful, Bruno, yes. What a beautiful historical anecdote. And,
I would say it's more than an anecdote.
You're right.
Talking about more than 100,000 soldiers of Mexican origin. But you know, there is a tragic part of that history. Many people say the Korean War is the forgotten war compared to other American wars Americans fought between the Second World War and the Middle East wars. But I would say that Mexicans are the forgotten soldiers of the Korean War. And that's something that we have to take into the light. Those people were never recognized. When I mentioned that to Korean, even historians of the Korean War, they just opened their eyes, saying, what are you talking about? Mexico was not part of the Korean War, not Mexico as a government. But we discovered that there were even Mexican platoons. At the time, soldiers were united by ethnicities under the American army, but any ethnic identity was suppressed. So we have testimonies of people who were in Korea saying that they were reprimanded when they spoke Spanish between each other. So I think it's important to recognize those guys. They came back to Mexico, they came back to the US, and they were not heroes, you know? It was not Mexico's war, and it was very embarrassing even to the Mexican government at the time to receive dead Mexicans coming from a war it was not fighting. Yeah. There is an internal politics component that I think we still have to study about Mexico's the Mexican government difficult position towards those thousands of Mexicans fighting in Korea.
Bruno, I know that you're in the peak of your diplomatic career, but once you're done, come to the Center of U.S. Mexican Studies and write that book. It's going to be a beautiful book. Okay.
Well, and I have an equal. I second the invitation, and also have an idea, which I'm sure you thought about. It sounds like we need a monument somewhere in South Korea to the contributions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in that war. Mr. Ambassador, there are a whole series of questions here, and I really just want to tell you briefly what they are because they reflect the interests of the audience. We can't go into each one, but I just want to acknowledge them. There are questions here about differences between Japanese and Korean investors in Mexico. You know, that's that economic theme. There's another question about the CPT, the CPTPP. There's a question about how integration within the Eurasian landmass may influence the trends in the Asia Pacific. But I'd be remiss for my Korean colleagues if I didn't at least raise the question about your dual status as ambassador simultaneously to South Korea, North Korea, and to Mongolia. Can I ask, have you visited Pyongyang, or does the Mexican government believe it's that's part of your mission to also touch base with what's going on in North Korea?
Yes, thank you for asking, Professor. Well, firstly, why is the Mexican ambassador to Seoul ambassador also to Pyongyang? That's a question many people ask. And we have to come back to the sunshine policy of President Kim Dae-jung, because it was his initiative, his government initiative, to ask foreign countries that had embassies in Seoul also to cover North Korea from South Korea in order to show the evolution that was expected in the inter-Korean relationship. And so a dozen of so countries do have cover both countries from Seoul. Now, what is a little bit strange about this situation is that there is absolutely no communications, as you know, Professor, between Seoul and Pyongyang. No citizen can communicate from South Korea to North Korea. It's forbidden. And so diplomats have that also cover North Korea have a lot of difficulties in getting information from North Korea, even communicating from North Korea. Said that, I haven't presented credentials yet to Pyongyang because when I was named ambassador at the end of 2016, things were very hot in the region. And the Mexican government at the time decided to expel the North Korean ambassador to Mexico. There is a North Korean embassy in Mexico City.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes.
That was quite a harsh decision to make. And so the embassy was not closed, but the ambassador was expelled. It was decided that I would not present credentials to North Korea. So on paper, I'm the ambassador, but in real terms, I haven't been formally presented as the ambassador in Pyongyang. I did present my credentials in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia 3 years ago, but still we will see how things evolve vis-a-vis North Korea.
Well, I have one last question, and then unfortunately we'll have to wrap up, but I just want to second Rafael's invitation. I hope you can come visit us in person, particularly if COVID passes. But was the expulsion of the North Korean ambassador tied to Mexico's commitment to UN Security Council sanctions resolutions? Was that the cause of his being ejected?
I can tell you the reasoning behind that, told by the vice minister at the time. And he said that the foreign ministry was criticized many times because of responding to foreign issues and circumstances through only communiques from the foreign ministry, condemning and blah, blah, blah. And so in that particular case, after something like 10 official communiques condemning North Korea because of the launching of nuclear tests and jeopardizing international security, the Mexican government decided to go one step further and retire the ambassador. That was the logic behind that.
Very, very interesting. Well, I think that reflects the kind of strong Mexican commitment to international law, which has always been a feature of Mexican diplomacy. Mr. Ambassador, I just can't tell you what a pleasure this was. The time kind of flew by. I mean, we didn't get to all the questions by a long shot. There are many more people who are sending their best wishes. But I take away two central messages from your presentation. One is that for our Mexican colleagues, including students and professionals, clearly there's a lot to be gained by having expertise on the Asia Pacific, which is part of our mission at GPS. But I want to speak equally to our Korean colleagues. Remember, Trans-Pacific relations is not just relations with North America, or with the United States, rather. It's relations between Korea and the Americas broadly conceived. These relationships are really developing in a very dynamic way. And I think your presentation reflects on that. So we like to keep this to exactly 1 hour. It's exactly 5 o'clock. I'm sure you have your day in front of you. But thanks so much, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us. And we hope we see you in the flesh at GPS at some point soon.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Rafael. I really enjoyed this conversation, this dialogue, and I keep the impression that many issues were still on the table. I also agree with you, Professor, that we need more young students, young people, learning more about this part of the world, about Asia, and especially gaining expertise. I think in Mexico, we still lack a lot of expertise doing business with the Far East, about the cultural aspect of that is so important. And we are not forming enough people learning Japanese, learning Chinese, and Korean. So there is a lot of things to do, and I'm sure that you are doing your part in San Diego, so close to Mexico. I enjoyed a lot this conversation. It was an honor for me, and Well, we can keep discussing through other ways.
Well, thanks very much. And for those of you, yeah, it was terrific. And for those of you who are still on, remember every week 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Mondays, we'll be having the Korea Pacific webinar. I can't promise they'll be as good as this one, but please join us. Thanks, Mr. Ambassador.